Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of Joshua. We are going to be in chapters 11 and 12, and it really closes out this section of the book of Joshua because it's the last of the, I guess you could say, the subduing of the kingdoms when they're coming into the land. And by chapter 13, it starts a whole new portion of the book where it begins to show how they take the allotment of the land. So as we see it from our perspective, a lot of names of places are given here that we're really not totally sure of. Of course, it meant a lot more at the time of the writing here because those would have been recognizable places. To us, we don't know all of them. If they can ever get to all of the places to dig up there, I'm sure that they could find all of these places. But if you've ever been to Israel, you know with as much as they've uncovered, there's so much more that they haven't. And so we do know where some of these places are. We pretty much have a good idea of where each of these groups are, and I'll have some maps that we'll put up during this time. But what has taken place to this point, if you haven't had a chance to study, you can go back and look either on the website or on the YouTube channel, and you can get kind of up to speed on this. But to draw the picture, if I could, what happens starting really with Jericho is they are on what would be, we would consider, the east side of the Jordan River. God's ready to bring them in. Jericho is the first place that they come to, and they have a couple of major encounters, the first being at Jericho, the next one being Ai. We know all the intrigues of Achan and the things that happened with Ai and the defeat, and then subsequent to that, the victory that they had. We know this, that the way that God had them subdue Jericho is totally different than that of Ai. And really going forward, they are military campaigns, all of them. Clearly miraculous still, because these are greater nations. God's told them that from the beginning. Greater in number, greater in who knows other ways too. Equipment, who knows. But in each case, as we will see even today, there is the miraculous that God does in bringing and subduing these nations before Israel. So they come in from east to west. Last study that we did was the kings in the south who would rise up against Israel, and more importantly, they were coming against the Gibeonites who had made a pact with Israel by guile and all the rest of it, but a pact nonetheless. And Joshua comes to their assistance, and they rout all of those southern kingdoms, and then go to the south where those kings came from, and they subdue the southern parts of the country. Where we are in chapters 11 and 12, really more in 11 than anything else, is the subduing of the northern kingdoms. And then there is a record, which we'll deal with when we get there in chapter 12, of the kings that had been defeated along the route from the time that they came out of Egypt all the way until where we are in this particular point. By chapter 13, we know this, as we'll look at next week. I want to save chapter 13 because, again, it opens up a whole new part of the book. So our study today may be a little bit shorter than normal, but suffice to say, it ends with the subduing of the country, if you will. Now, I know this is probably redundant for those who have been following along. I know I say it quite often, but I think it's a good reminder because it also helps us to deal with in our own sensibilities, the difficulties that we might have with the fact that God would tell his people to wipe out entire groups of other people. And so for us in our understanding in the context of the scripture and even what God has said by himself, he's ready to judge these people. So this was going to happen, the judgment of the Canaanites and all of the people who had occupied the land. God was ready to judge those people. He just happened to use the children of Israel at the same time that he is bringing them into the land for them to be his instrument of judgment against these nations. So let's make sure that we're always careful to understand this. The reason why this is happening is really, I guess we want to do it in big picture. It's twofold. God is judging the people of this country, or the nations or the kingdoms within Israel as we know it today. He's judging them, but also at the same time, his concern is not to have any of what they're doing remain. the very things that cause their judgment among their idolatry and their wickedness and their rebellion against God, if they're allowed to remain, God says they'll infest you with their idolatry and their paganism and all the rest. And we know from their history that's exactly what ended up happening. So with all of that said, what we'll look at today, and again, I'll put up some maps, it'll take us into the areas as they came into the land, and we hear often the Hivites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, all the different ites, and they kind of go north to south, and I'll have a map of that'll show which group was where. Remember, by this time that we get to chapter 11, the northern kingdoms have already been taken. Also, since it's written out like it happens in very quick succession, by the time that we get to chapter 13, after all of the wars were over, it says that God says to Joshua, you're aged now, you're old, and you haven't yet subdued the land. There's so much still left to be done. So it helps us in our understanding, best as we can tell, from the time that they came over the Jordan until times like what we see at the end of chapter 11 here, where they subdued the northern kingdoms. Years had gone on, maybe 6 to 7 years that they had been in the land and fighting these wars. And so it was a very, very long time as we would understand it. And God had even said that. There's just no way that you could do this all at one time. It's too great of a task. The people are too numerous, and he gives a number of reasons why. It wouldn't be that everybody in the land would come against Israel. This would be done in bits and pieces. So the south is subdued. They've gone quite a ways into the south, and if you're moving an army and people and everything else, that's not an easy thing to move them all the way south and have all the engagements that they did, and then turn your attention towards the north, which is where we are in chapter 11 right here. So with all of that as background, we get to chapter 11 and we find a few prominent cities, and again, having maps is kind of helpful in this, so I'll have a few of them up here. We'll get a chance to look at the groups of people that are mentioned here and where they were in the country, and then a couple of the prominent cities, like the one that's mentioned most prominently, Hazor. We have a pretty good idea where that is. There is an excavation that's there and a tell of Hazor that they're pretty sure is Hazor. So the other places are kind of in the area, some a little further north, other ones that are kind of a little bit to the south, but nonetheless, this would be in the northern part of the country, up around the Sea of Galilee. That's kind of where we're talking about here, where everything else has been done to the south, anywhere from just below where Jericho would be. That's basically taking in, of course, Jerusalem and everything moving towards the west from Jericho, and then all the way down towards the Dead Sea. That's already been taken. So with all of that said, chapter 11 is where we start today. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for our time in your word today, and we pray that we would be attentive to what we read and understand here. As we study the history, may we understand why that history is important, and may we, again, be attentive to the things that we can learn about you and your nature and how you do the things that you do among your people and among those who would rebel. And we ask, Lord, that you would be glorified in the teaching of your word, and that your Holy Spirit would lead and guide all that we do. We give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right, so chapter 11 starts out like this. Now it came to pass, when Jabin, the king of Hazor, heard these things, that he sent Jobab, the king, to Jobab, the king of Madon, and the king of Shimron, to the king of Achshaph. So these are some of the other prominent cities. Now we're going to hear by verse 10 that Hazor is the most prominent of all of them. It was a great site, if you will. Even now, something that's kind of in the general area that's been compared to it, we have a pretty good idea of what they call Tel Megiddo, or the ruins at Megiddo. And that's found in the Jezreel Valley. It's across the valley from Nazareth. You see it from Mount Carmel in the west. And Megiddo is an interesting place. Very, very ancient. Goes all the way back to Canaanite times, all the way back to Abraham. And the acreage of that place is smaller, though it's a very prominent city in that valley. It's smaller by about a third than what they have found at Hazor. So this was a pretty big place. It was on one of the trade routes, and this is what you find all throughout Israel. These major cities that might seem like they're situated in odd places, thinking back of when they were, these were the trade routes that would either run north to south or coming off of the coast from west towards the east and vice versa. You want to get things to the water so you can take them further west and, in both directions. So Hazor would be, because it's closer to Galilee, it's that east-west route, also runs north-south along the Mediterranean there. So, there's some inland things, there's stuff along the coast, but then there's ways to get things east to west. So this place is situated where a lot of the ports would be up in the northern part of Israel along the Mediterranean. And if you want to get that stuff inland as you're going towards what is modern-day Iraq and Iran, and then further east from that, this is in the routes, and that's how you would find the more prominent cities would be on these routes. So that helps us in our understanding why. Now you'll see again where Hazor is on some of these maps. Okay, so it tells us then to the kings who were from the north in the mountains, in the plain south of Chinneroth, in the lowland, and the heights of Dor on the west. Now, people have looked at this and thought maybe there's some kind of a contradiction here or a problem with the translation because the hills of Dor is more of a port city, but it's also a greater area. This would again be a major port, but as you travel towards the east, you get into a mountainous region, though it's not in Dor, but if you're looking towards that direction, whether from the sea or from the east, you're going to see mountains, and then Dor would be on either side of it, depending on your perspective. And some speculate maybe that's why they're called the hills. So with all that said, we get an idea really for us as we look at this in the 21st century. It's more that we're thinking north to south in the big general areas. The specifics are not as important. It meant more to them than I would say that it would mean to us, because again, we're just looking at history at this point, but that history and why it's important for us to understand God is bringing his people into the land after hundreds of years. We know when we looked at last week in chapter 15 of Genesis, God tells Abraham, I'm going to do this great work in you, but here's what's going to happen between now and then. Your descendants are going to go into a land that they don't know, and they're going to be enslaved there for 400 years. God tells him that before any of this could happen. There's not even a son to him, not an heir yet. And so it's going to go Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, Jacob to his 12 sons, who would end up in Egypt in a place of prominence only to turn to slavery in those 400 years. God says he's going to bring them back after the iniquity of the Amorites has come to a fullness. Right here, what we're reading is exactly that. So the offenses piled up by these people in Canaan had finally reached its point where God says judgment is coming. At the same time, he's bringing his people back into the land. So that helps us in our understanding of how did we get here, why now, why this. It answers all of those why questions that come up. So in verse 3 it says, now to the Canaanites in the east and to the west, to the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and to the mountains of the Hivite below Hermon in the land of Mizpah. So what he's pretty much just saying to us is by the groups of people, we're running south to north or north to south, depending on how you look at it. And again, there's a map that I'll put up that kind of helps us in our understanding of the general geographical area where they're all from. Verse 4 says, and so they went out, they and all their armies with them, many people, as the sand that is in the seashore in multitude, with very many horses and chariots. And when all the kings had met together, they came and they camped together at the waters of Merom, and they came to fight against Israel. So, once again, all of these kingdoms in the north come together, and what the writer here is wanting us to understand is that the multitude of these people, the amount of people, really kind of eclipses what you see that the children of Israel might have. So, in case we forget, it's not as though Israel, though it had many people with it in its group, and though it had many fighting men and everything else, the picture that's being drawn here is that they were outnumbered without question. Now, one of the things that you look at here, and you might say, well, how do you know that, and all the rest of it, because even the imagery that's being presented here for us is that the writer wants us to know this was not just an army, it was formidable and pretty much overwhelming if you stop to think of it, and it would have caused a great amount of concern to a person like Joshua and any of his fighting men, because notice what is said here in verse 6. But the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them, because, here's why, tomorrow about this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel, and you shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So here God says, not only am I going to deliver them into your hands, but I want you to make it where no one will be able to use their implements of war going forward. Because again, this is in the north, and it's such a diverse large area. The last thing you want them to do, for those that might get away, is to reformulate things. They're going to go in, they're going to attack the cities and the kings and all the rest of it, but people are going to scatter. What you don't want is for them to be able to try to mount another attack. So, verse 7 says, so Joshua and all the people of war with him came against them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they attacked them. So it was a preemptive thing. They see them there. They don't wait. God says, I'm going to deliver them into your hand, and so they go. Now, this is important for us to remember once again. There have been those times, from the time that they came out of Egypt, that God has done miraculous things, said he would do miraculous things, and yet there were those times you go, why did you guys listen? He's been so faithful to do everything that he said, and yet here you doubt. Well, in some ways, there are a couple of mistakes that Joshua has made. The thing with AI, getting so locked into, well, it's always this way, that you don't want to just say, well, just because he did it that way yesterday doesn't mean that he'll do it that way tomorrow. Maybe we should check in with him. In this case, God comes to him because it's a pretty frightening thing. Look at these armies that are amassed against us. God comes to Joshua and says, don't be concerned. This time tomorrow, those guys are going to be put into your hands. Wipe them out. Burn their chariots, hamstring their horses, don't leave any of it alone. So with that as the marching orders, he doesn't say wait for them to attack. Obviously, he gives them order to go forward. I've delivered them into your hands. It's already a foregone conclusion. So with that being said, Joshua and all the people of war came against them suddenly. Now, verse 8, and of course, the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who defeated them and chased them to Greater Sidon. This is modern-day Lebanon, up into the area where Lebanon meets Syria along the Mediterranean. So this shows that it even chased them outside of what would be modern-day Israel. They went and chased them as far that way into the north. Hazor, remember, is around the Sea of Galilee. So it is for them to chase them from there all the way up north and west. So long distance that they chased them away. So they chased them to Greater Sidon, to the brook of Misrephoth, and to the valley of Mizpah eastward. They attacked them until none of them were remaining. And so Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses, burned their chariots with fire. Joshua then turned back at this time, and he took Hazor. So if he's run pretty much everything north, east, and west, he's chased them back to the north. Now he turns his attention, comes back towards the Galilee, and Hazor is there. Now, in verse 10, why Hazor? We're given the answer to that. First of all, it was the king of Hazor who started this. He's the one who brought together the coalition, and it's far and away the most prominent of the cities. And so God makes an example of it. Instead of doing this with all of them, he makes an example of Hazor in particular, as we see in verse 10. Joshua turned back at this time, and he took Hazor, struck the king with the sword, for Hazor was formerly the head of all of the kingdoms. It was the greatest of the great ones, and it's why this king started the coalition against the children of Israel by gathering in those other kings. So this was the prominent one. Now, again, if you want to send a signal of what happened, remember, by this time, they've already heard. Let's remember a couple of other things. Remember when they first came into the nation, and Joshua sent the spies in to spy out Jericho. Remember what it was that Rahab had said. We've heard about what happened from the parting of the Red Seas. Now, or the Red Sea. So they know back to the very beginning of the Exodus. If they know that the waters were parted and that the people came through, they know also of the things that happened as they came up through Edom and through Moab and through Ammon and the kings that were destroyed there. They would have to know what happened to Egypt and to Pharaoh and to Pharaoh's armies. All of that stuff is renowned, and it was 40 years before Rahab even was able to see them. But she knew, as did the kings. She said that the kings and the people of this land, their hearts are failing them for fear of you, because the God that you serve is able to do these things. So for these decades, they have known that they were coming, and they know of the exploits of what God has done, even with the failures. So in they come to the area of Israel, beginning at Jericho. And by this time, the kings in the north have heard what's happened to the kings of the south, and they know what's gone on over the last 40 years. So it is the king of Hazor, the prominent city in the north, who brings this coalition together, and now they're going to be made an example of. Once again, this would be something that would say, who's going to stand against the children of Israel? God started out by wiping out Pharaoh in Egypt and everything along the route, though they were not trying to conquer everything on their way to the promised land. Remember, as they came through Moab and through Edom and through those areas, all they wanted to do was pass through the land. And the kings of those places wouldn't have any of it. And it was really a difficult thing. When war would happen, Israel was successful. So that's where we are in the history. They're getting into the last of the subduing of the kingdoms in order to be able to occupy the land. So we get in verse 12, so all the cities of those kings and their kings Joshua took, and he struck by the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded him. Now, I skipped over verse 11. Let me go back to it. Let me just start at verse 10. Joshua turned back at that time, and he took Hazor. He struck it with the sword, for Hazor was formerly the head of all of those kingdoms. And they struck all the people who were there with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was none left breathing, and then he burned Hazor with fire. He didn't do this with any of the other places. He made an example of this. Obviously, God had told him to do so. Once again, if you can wipe out Hazor and burn it to the ground, that sends the message to all the other places. Now, verse 12. So the cities of those kings and all of their kings Joshua took and struck with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. But as for the cities that stood on their mounds, Israel burned none of them, except for Hazor only, which Joshua burned. So they would take the cities, they would conquer them, but they weren't burning them to the ground, only Hazor, making an example, if you would. Verse 14, and of the spoil of these cities, the livestock the children of Israel took as spoil or as booty for themselves, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they left nothing breathing. As the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So remember, Moses is now brought back into the narrative, because this was something that was given for Moses to do. Only God knew at the time that Moses would never be able to complete the task, for reasons that we know, but it was never told him along the way until the very end that Moses, because of the things that you've done, you won't be the person to lead them in, but the command was still given to him nonetheless, because the objective in the end was going to be completed, but it would be done through Joshua and not through Moses. Let me point out one other thing, because I've already said it at the beginning, but it bears repeating because it's so difficult for our sensibilities to wrap our minds around this. Look at, again, the second part of verse 14. But they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed, them, and left none breathing. That means they were all killed. So why would God give such a command? Remember, it is God judging the people of the land above all things. He was going to do this no matter how he was going to do it. He used his people as a way of doing it. And think about this. Would that not just indelibly impress in your mind a reason why you should be careful not to provoke God and do things that should never be done, because God, though he is loving and caring and all the rest of that, he is also just, and he judges that kind of wickedness, because that kind of wickedness will lead to an eternity separated from him. It would be better, as we can hopefully understand, for them to be gone than for them to be gone and the children of Israel because of that corruption. Because it's an eternal matter. We're getting too focused often when we think of this. We get focused on the here and now, not looking at the eternal. So with that being said, verse 16, thus Joshua took all the land, the mountain country, and all the south, the land of Goshen to the lowland. This means he's getting down towards Egypt. The Jordan plain, the mountains of Israel and its lowlands from Mount Halak to Seir, even as far as Baal Gad, and the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. That's all the way in the very northernmost portion of the country. So he captured all their kings, struck them down, and killed them. Joshua made war a long time with those kings, and there was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel except for the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon, or what we would call the Gibeonites. We studied that last week, and they, by guile and cunning, they got them to make a pact with the Gibeonites. And so you can go back and read that if you haven't, or go back and watch it rather. We went over that. So it says, all the others they took in battle, verse 19. Now verse 20 says, for it was the Lord who had, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts. I want to stop here because this is an important thing. This is that theological question that comes up now. When you see hardening hearts, this is one of those places where people who believe that God decrees every action and that man has no free will whatsoever, they'll point to a place like this and say, see right there, it says God hardened their hearts. So it wasn't that they decided to do it, it's that God made them do it. Okay, that's one possible way of looking at it, because we will find this is the same kind of phrasing that's used of Pharaoh. Excuse me. And if you look back at the whole thing that happened with Pharaoh, you'll find a place where it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then you'll find other places where it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. When you read through all of those things in the exchange with Moses and at the Exodus, there are other places in the same narrative where it says Pharaoh's heart was hardened. It doesn't say who it was that caused it. So we have to look at a few different options. Was it God who hardened his heart? Or was it Pharaoh who hardened his heart? Or could the phrase just simply means this? Pharaoh's heart was hardened and God solidified it, or put it in that place that was the final answer, if you will, that Pharaoh was hardened and there was no changing it, so God locked him in on that position and then judgment fell. To me, that's the only way to reconcile the idea that man, or in this case, Pharaoh, was given the ability to do it, but his own pride would not allow it. His hardness of heart, God then solidified him in that. He wasn't going to change his mind. So as we look in the Old Testament, you'll never find a place when it comes to a matter of salvation that God makes a person do anything. He gives invitation, if you will, but doesn't make them make the decision. That's something that comes up because of the writings mainly of Paul, that can be meant one of a couple of ways. Did God already know that the decisions that would be made and then allowed those decisions to be locked in, or did he make those things happen? So again, if God decrees everything and makes these things take place and man has no free will in it, then for reasons known only to him, he has the ability to change their hearts, but determines that some will be saved and some will be damned. And what does that say about him, that if he has the capacity to save all, he only saves a small few? It just makes no sense whatsoever when you have the other option open, that God desires that all men would come to him, but not all men do because of the hardness of their hearts, that God holds them responsible for that hardness. So with that being said, again, people are going to argue over that. I will never be able to persuade somebody who is of the other opinion that God decrees everything. So I don't even try it anymore. But, verse 20, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle. So that he might utterly destroy them, and that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now, at that time, Joshua came and he cut off the Anakim. This is an interesting group of people. Again, we're going to find out the Anakim were giants, and that goes all the way back into long before they came into the land. They were encountering these groups of people coming up through Edom into Moab as they're moving up along the eastern side of what is the Jordan River and what comes out of the Dead Sea as it heads down towards the Gulf there. They encountered these people that were giants. Remember the reports that were given by the spies that went into the land in Numbers, 14? That is kind of an interesting thing when you consider it, because once again, giants are mentioned. So they're kind of interesting people. We don't know a great deal about them, but notice what it says about this. Now, at that time, verse 21, Joshua came, and he cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron to Debir, and from Debir, to Anab. And from the mountains of Judah and the mountains of Israel, Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. So they come considerably further to the south. Now, the thing about this, again, we don't know all of the really specific areas, but we do know, because of some of the geographical information given and the places that they have been able to understand, this starts to say that this group of people here is kind of set up a little differently, and we're going to find out why. This is really kind of, by that time, you're going to find out that, especially during the time of Saul and David, this is the same group that was going to give them so much trouble. We know them as the Philistines. So here we see them kind of introduced to us in a roundabout way before we knew them in the time of the kings. So it says, verse 21, none of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. So Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, that is basically showing you from the south up to the north along the Mediterranean coast. This is where the Philistines would have been. And again, when you think about it, this is Goliath. Think of Goliath, and that freakishly large human being is from this group of people. They defeated them much more inland, but then they chased them back to the coast. And so this is where they would be. So Joshua, verse 23, took the land according to all that the Lord had said to Moses. Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel, according to the divisions of their tribes, and then the land rested from war. The land rested from war. This kind of closes out, if you will, the coming into the land and the taking it by force. Chapter 11 ends that. Chapter 12 is kind of a chronicle of all of the military victories. Now, why take the time to enumerate these and remember them person by person? History is a very, very important thing so that you don't forget where you've come from. And so a chronicle is written down here. I do find there's an interesting thing that we find in our country right now. As I record this, we're in July of 2020. And I find so many in our own country looking to absolutely erase and destroy our history. Some of it, we want history to remember why we don't do the things that we do or have done. Other times we want to say this is where we've come from, let's not forget. And whether people like or dislike the history will depend. That's really going to set in place why they believe what they believe. Well, with all of that said, chapter 12 is a great illustration to us of why history is kept, so that people remember where they came from, and it helps to moor them or anchor them to where they should be and remember these things. So chapter 12 starts out this way. Now these are the kings of the land whom the children of Israel defeated, and whose land they possessed on the other side of the Jordan toward the rising of the sun, from the river Arnon to Mount Hermon and all the eastern Jordan plain. So this is the area that was taken as they begin to come into the land. Now think about it like this. If it was in the further part of the south on the eastern side of the Jordan River, they weren't really much interested in that. They weren't interested in the land until it got kind of north of what would be the Dead Sea kind of on the parallel with where Jericho was, and then further up into the north. Now, this was Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. They wanted that. As they got into the area that they desired to have, that's when they get into Moab and then up into Ammon. This is where they wanted to be, and these are the kings that were subdued, because that land was then ultimately given to those 2.5 tribes. Again, Gad, Reuben, half of Manasseh. So with that being said, one of those kings, verse 2, was Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon, and he ruled over half of Gilead from Aror, which is on the bank of the river Arnon, from the middle of that river even as far as river Jabbok, which is on the border of the Amorites. I'm sorry, of the Ammonites. And the eastern Jordan plain from the Sea of Chinneroth, another way of saying Galilee, Chinneroth as far as the Sea of Arabah, and that's the Dead Sea, and the road to Beth Jeshimoth, and southward towards the slopes of Pisgah. So once again, think about this. This is kind of everything from the Dead Sea north all the way up, even above the Sea of Galilee and a little bit towards the east, but close enough to the Jordan River. They didn't go that far towards the east. That was a pretty fertile plain, if you will, but it's also in a low-lying area. So if you look at anywhere from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea, it goes from a very low point. I think Sea of Galilee is like 700 feet below sea level, and the Dead Sea is about 1,300. So these are some very, very low points. Dead Sea is as low as you get, and still have dry ground as anywhere on the earth. So in that lower lying area, it's fertile ground. So this is where some of them had wanted to stay. And then we see at verse 4, the other king was Og, king of Bashan, and his territory, who was the remnant of the giants, there again, and they dwelt at Ashtaroth and Edrei. So it just mentions giants in the general sense. So there is a whole lot that's going on here that, again, all we can do is speculate on it. God seems to have a particular problem with these people, and we're not sure exactly why. Some people would look all the way back to Genesis 6 and the group called Nephilim and their offspring and all the rest of that. That's not really a topic for today. But mentioning giants and all the rest of it as an unusual group of people, other than just their stature, there are some other things about them that God seems to have a particular interest in, but doesn't give us a great amount of detail. So with that being said, they're even mentioned here, not by their kings necessarily, but just as them in their physical attribute. So with that being said, verse 5, it says, let's just do verse 4 again. The other king was Og, the king of Bashan, and his territory, who was of the remnant of the giants, who dwelt at Ashtaroth and Edrei, and he reigned over Mount Hermon, over Selka. Now, Mount Hermon's up in the north, over Bashan as far as the border of the Girgashites and the Maccathites, and over half of Gilead, over the border of Sihon, the king of Heshbon. These Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the children of Israel had conquered, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given it as a possession to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and to half of the tribe of Manasseh. So this again, this deals with the time when Moses was overseeing things, and it's everything to the east of the river Jordan. Everything that is on the west of Jordan happened under Joshua, and it is what we would consider modern-day Israel proper. So with that being said, verse 7 is a different part. This deals with the time of Joshua, and these are the kings of the country which Joshua and the children of Israel conquered on this side of the Jordan, on the west, from Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon as far as Mount Halak, and the ascent of Seir, which Joshua gave to the tribes of Israel as possession according to their divisions. So what you're going to basically get is And even to this day, it's kind of the same way. From the time that you get up into the north, around the border of modern-day Lebanon, Israel occupies and lives in much of the land from there all the way down until you get to what is modern-day Beersheba. And then it really starts to thin out quite a bit to the south. And especially going south and towards the east, there's a lot of area there that is mainly uninhabited. It's just huge, wide open desert, and there's not a lot that's there. So it was even back at that time, because of water and all the rest of it, that you don't find that much happens beyond Beersheba ever. And even in the Bible, it's mentioned that when they want to talk north to south, they'll mention Dan to Beersheba. These are the biggest of the prominent cities from north to south before you start to have a real, thinning out of everything. That's pretty much what's being given here as far as the amount of land that's being spoken of. So it says now in verse 8, in the mountain country, in the lowlands of the Jordan plain, in the slopes, in the wilderness, and in the south, the Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Again, I'll have a map on that. So then verse 9 says, the king of Jericho was one king, and then we'll just run through these. You can go back and look them up if you haven't been with us through the study. This is just going to tell you pretty much, it's going to enumerate for you the kings and the cities where they were the kings over those areas and those particular cities. They were the head of those places. And it pretty much just gives you a rundown of all of the people that they encountered from north to south. This is a historical record given so that people will remember what God had done. That's why it's preserved here. So it says, verse 10, the king of Jerusalem, 1, king of Hebron, 1, and I'm not going to keep repeating 1. I'm just going to say the names. King of Jarmuth. Notice it doesn't even give the names of the kings, just that king over that area, that one guy. So, king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish in verse 11, verse 12, the king of Eglon, the king of Gezer, the king of Debir in verse 13, and the king of Geder, verse 14, the king of Hormah, and the king of Arad, verse 15, Libnah and Adullam, and verse 16, Mekkedah and Bethel. Now, Bethel is one of those we would recognize, just very, very short distance to the north, a few miles to the north of Jerusalem. So, in verse 17, Tupah and Hepher. In verse 18, Aphek and Lesharon. Now, Aphek, there are two places called Aphek. We see one of them when we're in Israel, and it's much further to the north. There's also an Aphek down in the south, and that seems to be the one that is mentioned here. And then the king of Medan and the king of Hazor, we get those up in the north. The king of Shimron, Meron, and the one of Akasaph. In verse 21, Tanakh and Megiddo. Now, see, the king of Megiddo, this is kind of interesting because that's definitely up in the north, but that's also in what we would consider the Valley of Armageddon. So if you're looking out from Mount Carmel, and the Mediterranean is out to our west, and you're looking down this way, and you're looking, so then that would be to the south and to the east. Over here would be, reversed for you. Over here would be Nazareth, and over here would be Megiddo, and then the Valley of Armageddon's in the middle as it runs out that way. So, with that being said, we get in verse 22, the king of Kadesh and the king of Jokneam in Carmel. Again, these are all the northern kings that are spoken of. The king of Dor in the heights of Dor, and the people of Gilgal, and then verse 24 of Tisra, and then of these kings, all of them were 31. So these are the kings and their kingdoms, 31 of them that Joshua had overseen after they had come into the land. That's why it is important for us to remember the amount of time that it would have taken to do this, because again, it is north to south, and you're moving armies, and you're coming up with strategy, and you're preparing, and you're gathering, and you're getting all the things necessary for it. So this was a campaign that took years in order to complete. So what we get now, when we turn to chapter 13, which we'll get to next week, is now that the land is subdued, now it's time for the people to move and to take their possession. What did God give to them, and where will they be? And we'll get maps, of course, of where this all takes place, and we'll have those up when we get to the study of that, starting at chapter 13. So what we'll do for this one, again, I'll put up maps so that you get an idea of north to south where this was, the people that lived in the land, where that was, and what was going to be given to them. It helps us in our understanding of not only modern Israel, but also what it was in those times. Though God gave them a much more expanded area, where they settled is very much what we would consider Israel proper today in our 21st century. So with that being said, we'll pick up chapter 13 next week, because it is a whole brand new section of this book. And it changes dramatically. Now they're going to be able to cease, as we saw, they cease from war at the chapter 11, and then chapter 12 being the chronicle of what God had done, moving them into the land as they moved from east to west, then down towards the south, and ultimately up to the north. It was a cleansing of the land from those that God wanted to see removed and judged them. Now he brings his people in. It's a clean slate. And wouldn't it be wonderful had they just been obedient to him? They never would have been displaced again. But yet, again, this gives us an understanding of human history for these last 3,000 years. So pretty interesting stuff. We'll pick it up there next week, and just pray that as you continue to read through this, please do. Feel free to read ahead and become familiar with what we've been looking at and what we will look at, and we'll pick it up there next week.